My name's Owen McGill. I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow in Scotland. Today I'm going to be talking on my master's research, which is Recalling Hidden Harms, the Autistic Experiences of Early Childhood Applied Behavioural Analysis. Just as a starting point, some of the content that I will discuss today is quite harrowing. It's very emotive and some people might find it a little bit distressing. So just as a warning, unfortunately, I know ABA can be quite triggering for a lot of people, and this talk's going to focus a lot on these participants' experiences of ABA. So a bit of an overview. I'll start off with a little bit of background to the research, understanding where this need for early intervention comes from with regards to autism, a brief overview of applied behavioural analysis and autism, looking for the autistic voice. Then I'm going to discuss our approach and spend a good bit of time on the thematic analysis, which focused on our hidden harms. We're going to look a little bit at the implications of the findings and adaptations that have followed research since our study. These aren't specifically to do with our research, but just where we've been cited and where the field is starting to adapt and where we're seeing the autistic voice and experiences of ABA becoming more ingrained into the discussion of applied behavioural analysis and autism intervention. So research was published in Advances in Autism into 2020, so it's available through there. There's also my Strathpure website has access to the paper free of charge if you don't have a login, if it's something you'd like to read. There have been many changes since our initial research, and this idea was conceptualised from my focus during my master's on trying to understand where behavioural and early interventions were focused. At that point in my journey, I hadn't fully come to the realisation that I'm autistic, and there was a lot of confusion on my side as to where these interventions were focusing, why they were used, and the sort of structure of them. And it was actually my supervisor, Anna Robinson, who had conceptualised the idea of focusing on the autistic experience of ABA, because throughout my research and my initial research stages, all I was finding was parent and practitioner reflections on ABA. So is there a need for early intervention within autism and following autism diagnosis? So the diagnostic criteria continues to frame autism in terms of deficit, repetitive behaviour, social communicative issues. This diagnostic criteria does retain a lacking focus on the potential of the individual. So we have a system that's set up looking at this universalised or generalised perception of autism, focused on deficits, focused on how the individual isn't normal or the average of society. And this is built on an outsider perspective, which really places the positioning of how autism is seen as a sort of worrying trend, and how these deficits have continued to be placed upon autism. So as we've seen this diagnostic and treat pathway progress, alongside that we've had older theories of autism, such as theory of mind, empathising, systemising, mind blindedness. So all these early theories that really placed autism in an androcentric or a masculine perspective and looked at how autistic people don't have empathy. So all these outsider perspectives didn't relate to the individual inside and didn't relate to how we actually perceive the world around us. So through following a medical model focused on deficits, the way in which autism diagnosis is perceived has really been shaped by a medical lens, and we can see this expanding into a negative perspective. So then we look at this little diagram I have on the side where we have diagnosis. The diagnosis is focused on deficits or perceived deficits in autism. This is beginning to change a little bit, thankfully, as autistic voice has been taken far more seriously and given positions of influence and being given positions within empirical research. So when we follow this diagnose and treat pathway, we look at the clinicians, diagnosticians start to look at the perceived need for early intervention and seeing how this, through research, is viewed as critical for positive life outcomes. And as it filters down, one of the more positively perceived, and as Sarah talked about before me, has issues of its own. Applied behavioural analysis is then seen as the gold standard autism intervention through its very long years and body of research. So we are having this slight change from this diagnose and treat pathway. Autistic and autism researchers are combating these constructs. This is something that's following on. Sometimes research doesn't quite follow current practice, doesn't follow advocacy as closely as it can. So these are reflections of voices and advocacy that have been happening for such a long time and are gradually filtering their way into more mainstream, more empirical evidence. These are such things as the double empathy theory from Milton and looking at autism as a difference rather than a deficit. So where does this need for early intervention lie? A lot of research has seen results which suggest that brain plasticity is far more malleable during early childhood, so that point is easier to manipulate and mould children's behaviours, understanding how they engage with the world around them. This early engagement, seen with a need to create a normal or average child, again, given how autism is perceived as deficit model, with a lot of diagnostics, that's where a lot of the perceived need for intervention comes from. So a brief kind of look at autism and ABA. So applied behavioural analysis, it remains this gold standard for autism for positive intervention, positive outcomes for children. Much of that is framed through the research of over 40 years. So it's become the preferred intervention from a behavioural and clinical perspective for autistic children. There's a focus on repetition, consistency, discrete trials. There's still diverse use of punishers, whether those come from language, whether those are social punishers, so removal of certain situations, removal from certain environments, whether we're seeing items taken away. And again, whether Judge Rottenberg mentioned earlier, there are the shock therapy that still continues to be used. Given that ABA has such a long-standing evidence base within its research and empirical findings of over 40 years, prior to our research and Kupferstein's in 2018, there were only 3 studies which looked at any form of long-term outcome, and the term long-term here is quite differently used, as the longest was 4 to 4.5 years following ABA. So these studies conducted on the efficacy of ABA in early intervention concluded results which engage with superior or more positive outcomes in childhood intervention. And there was a study by and it wasn't as empirical as it could have been, the Army in America, that actually concluded that there was no efficacy from ABA. Other research has shown that once these punishers are removed, after a pretty standard period of time, the actual outcomes and what ABA was trying to remove, people fall back in to these comforts, but that's seen as regressing back into behaviours which weren't normal, which were what ABA was trying to remove. But these are just things such as stimming, looking at comforts. And we're now seeing this growing trend in research where an understanding of autistic experiences of ABA is beginning to grow, and that's Anderson's research published this year. And once I've gone through our hidden harms and our research outcomes, I will have a little bit of a discussion on where Anderson's research actually intersects with our own. So looking here at where the autistic voice has been prior to our own research, Anderson's, Kupferstein's, where the autistic voice lay within ABA research was non-existent. What's happened is we've seen this long-standing level of advocacy, level of promotion from autistic voices outside of academia, which have long-standingly said that autistic experiences have been negative of ABA. It's the quality of ABA, the aims of ABA, the actual intervention itself all these have been called into question for a very long time by autistic voices, as far back as the early 90s when the internet itself was just taking off. So these are long-standing issues with ABA, and it's just now catching up in academia. So the approaches with academia are taking this gradual turn. The autistic voice has been missing or silenced, and that's been historically within empirical research, not solely within ABA. A lot of these voices and the argument that was given towards ABA experiences being negative was that people who were talking out, speaking out, advocating against could do so because of ABA, or simply hadn't been part of ABA, so would have no idea what they were talking about, had been influenced by outsiders, were taking these extremist perspectives based on what one, possibly two people have experienced, which, as talk about, isn't necessarily the case. So the application of ABA and this consistency, repetition, has been perceived as leading to burnout for many participants who have taken part. This idea of false oppositions below that came from Dawson. So this distortion of real world perceptions with an if-then narrative that formed quite a lot of the perceived need for ABA, and that if these autistic children participate in childhood ABA, then they will see far better outcomes than if they don't receive ABA. Then they are going to end up as people who potentially are on medication all their life, who are in some way not normal to others within society. So trauma and other related stressors have been caused by ABA from people who've partaken in ABA rather than without it. So looking at this if-then narrative, flipping that perspective, if an autistic child does not receive ABA, then they're going to be looking at a traumatic life within society. What's happened from Kupferstein and from the growing body of research and Autistic Voices is saying that this trauma is actually caused by ABA rather than without ABA. So harm, not help, is a message being given by autistic individuals excuse me, who have participated in ABA at a young age. And the voices are gradually filtering into academic thought and these empirical findings. So our approach was using online and semi-structured interviews, so online survey and online interviews. So we had 11 participants participate within an online survey on Qualtrics and 2 semi-structured interviews, which took place over instant messengers on email. So the participant demographic, 12 in all, 10 participants had negative outcomes or negative experiences, sorry, and 2 had positive experiences. There was 1 parent and 1 short-term intervention were removed. The parent was removed and shown within and then removed because they were using phrases like, as a parent, I am able to, as parents, we should be able to choose this intervention, we should be able to promote this intervention. And the short term was less than a month of this intervention. Throughout the process, Anna and myself met. We were going through coding, clustering the data, readdressing. We would meet, create the themes, go away, read them separately, pass each other's on that we'd come across, meeting together, readdressing. And then as we got to this finalisation of codes, we were going back and looking at the actual autistic reflections to ensure that we weren't ourselves taking our own perspectives or our own understandings of the data, and making sure that these voices were being promoted within our research outcomes. And that led to the overall theme, which was conceived as hidden harms. So this is a brief table just looking at the 5 core themes on the left and then the sub-themes on the right. I'm going to go through each of these themes and sub-themes piece by piece. So this is just sort of a warning on the distressing content that we will explore. So I'm just going to forward now. So behaviourist methods create painful experiences. So within this theme, participants had looked at the actual methods and the implementation of ABA intervention. And within this point, the participants at the beginning were really reflecting on these painful experiences. It was very open, very emotive, especially with our two instant messenger interviews. So repetitive schooling with physical interventions. I was physically restrained, kept from using the toilet, force fed. I was punished by having to do it again and again and again. In ABA, they say when you get a reward if you do it, they mean you get it if you do it the way they wanted the first time. If it's not done right the first time, the treats were removed and you were punished by repeating the act or skill or reaction over until you get it right. Trained to perform like trained like an animal to perform. So they trained me like a dog to act like a neurotypical or else. If I complied, they complimented in a condescending manner and gave me what I liked, just as you would to a puppy. I was treated like an animal, more like an animal than a person. They tried to stop me stimming, which I need to do to stay calm, prevent meltdowns, and express myself. And whose empathy problem is this? I shut down quickly and was non-verbal, yet they treated me as verbal and didn't try to find alternate ways to communicate. When they told me I was being shocking on purpose, that I was lying about what I felt, was just because I was being lazy and didn't want to do my therapy. So within these behaviourist methods, creating painful experiences, participants began to explore this lack of agency within the process, this removal of power, and this consistent repetition, being treated as someone less than human, being treated like an animal, and this lack of understanding as to who doesn't have empathy within the process. So erosion of true actualizing self. The first sub-theme here was shutting down of the realistic me. ABA changed the way I act, react, or interact with the world. The aim was to force a square peg into a round hole instead of being okay with being who I am. Better to stay safe and isolated than rejected. And ABA taught me that being able to fool people I was neurotypical was my best goal in life. The second sub-theme here, mental health through trauma, really focused on those long-term felt outcomes, sometimes that weren't taken seriously, some that were given reasoning and given conclusions that they were from other aspects or simply by not being a strong-willed person. I now have clinical depression as a result of experiencing ABA. Nearly all of our participants reflected on it gave me PTSD in some manner. Almost every individual who had a negative experience did focus on issues they faced with mental health, and that's not solely through PTSD. That was the impact they'd felt upon their social situations and how that mental health, that trauma, really placed a lot of anxiety on social situations, understanding how to react in different social situations that weren't part of ABA and weren't part of that social training. And I've turned into an anxious person, afraid of consequences. So there was a real aversion created there to any form of conflict, to any form of being seen negatively within social context, within school context, within real life context. And this rejecting self-loathing. So there was extreme poor self-esteem due to self-loathing, which was forced. And this is traumatic. It created internalized ableism, self-loathing. So this rejection of autistic self, so people's core identity within this experience, they began to reject it. They began to take what they actually, their identity, their diagnosis, who they were, and it created this idea of hatred and loathing towards self and self-rejection. So a lack of self-agency within interpersonal exchanges. Here, participants focused on their feeling of powerlessness. This created helplessness and how they had no say, no ability to influence the outcomes, their own agency, the actual practice of ABA and their position within it. So being left voiceless and mute was something that 9 out of our 10 participants who had these negative experiences felt and reflected upon. So entirely coercive. ABA controlled all aspects of reinforcers and adversaries completely. I had no choice. The conversation was over when and only when they said it was over, and talking about me like I'm not there. So as we look at left voiceless and mute, these perceptions really filter in with the mental health and the anxiety created around social situations, created around just interacting on a daily level with people, whether that's within the home, within family, or outside, within work. So dependency with an enduring fear. The focus on compliance made it harder for me to say no to people who hurt me later. It took nearly 2 more years before I started to converse with someone without someone initiating. So the dependency really brings forward this lack of self-agency, this lack of power, and it also highlights the vulnerability that some participants within our research experienced following their intervention, because of that creation and focus on social situations and how they should be structured. And pretending to be someone else, I am no longer capable of being myself around others. Outside of my own control, I observe them and make a person that they will most likely enjoy. I actively change myself around others to a staggering degree. ABA made it much harder to make friends because I was spending so much time trying to pretend to be someone I'm not that I could never really connect to people. I masked constantly because I was taught being autistic isn't okay. Outside of our research, the growing research on masking that has been ongoing for quite a long time, we can see the impacts that masking has on as we get older, as we start to see that we're losing ourselves, that we're pretending to be someone else, and that we're using that as a modem to control our own anxiety, control ourselves and others within social situations. Here, participants started to realise that their autistic self was being lost, that they weren't actually themselves, and that very core identity and understanding of self that so many people go through childhood, early teens, wasn't actually present for them. So self-healing and compassion, this marked quite a strong and powerful element to these participants' experiences. This is when participants looked after their ABA experiences and at themselves and started to take back that lack of agency, take back that lack of power, and start to explore themselves through self-healing, compassion, understanding of their own identity. So who am I really? I've turned into an anxious person, afraid of consequences, good or bad, and I got depressed and lost my interests, which were used as a reinforcer. I stress when I do things like dishes, when it should just be a very simple task. So here, participants started to realise and started to take into account who they are, what their identity is, how they'd been changed. Why am I such an anxious person, afraid of consequences, whether these are good or bad consequences? Why are these stressors put on me when they're such easy tasks? For some people, sorry. So searching for me, being autistic is okay. That's marked that turning point, that real aspect of power and power reclamation, where participants started to understand themselves, their autistic self, their autistic identity, and started to reclaim that. So I still feel ashamed of who I am. Rationally, I know that being autistic isn't wrong. It's just a different way of thinking. Nobody can see the emotional and mental scars that have been caused by the trauma and damage done by ABA. So shaming and ableist thinking was hammered into my brain from the time I was a preschooler. In recent years, I've begun undoing the damage on my own. So that reclamation also took part through rediscovering my lost loves. These possible to many people small, maybe insignificant things that were used as punishers, things that were taken away. There was one participant who loved books. Reading was their escape throughout ABA intervention, throughout their early childhood. And these were used as these punishers and reinforcers. They were taken away, stolen away, only when this individual had performed to what the practitioners wanted, needed, required, were they given back their books. And this here, these rediscovering my lost loves, a small laptop for them to use and take home. And I got one as well, my lifesaver. I hid them, then stayed up at night playing on it, the most crucial point of my life. I tried to go on a computer. Therapists said they're for adults or children that can talk. Now I communicate mostly online. It's like I'm taking back control. So the second individual there continues to use non-verbal communication, but this represented, and for the other participant above, really crucial and empowering moment within their lives. And the final theme that we have really brought together these experiences of ABA as a whole, and it was produced under the theme Hear My Angry Voice. There was a message of anger, a message of frustration, but still a message of re-empowerment, a message which took back control. So we reject ABA with your ableist philosophy. This is not something we need our children going through. Stop trying to fix us. Short-term success isn't worth the long-term PTSD, and it is a bogus intervention which should not be recommended to autistic people if they are not adults and are not capable to fully understand the methods which will be used on them and the risks for their own well-being. See my strengths, look at us as autistic individuals and look at our strengths. Look away from the deficits, look to the individual. Focus on affirming what's good about autism, along with helping to develop skills to navigate our society. Don't make us fit in. Help us to understand the society around us. Don't force. The best approach would be to see what goals the autistic kid has, let them direct the skill they want to learn, and to understand the way autistic people think isn't bad. Not all of us grow up to be like Dr. Sean Murphy on The Good Doctor. Some of us do. It's all about interest, environment, and how they're taught. And nothing without us means autistic-led. So this final sub-theme really built on nothing about us without us. That advocacy, that call. Have autistic adults teach autistic children. They would know the children and what's best for the children in a far better and far more humane capacity. And have autistic adult mentors to guide parents in selecting any therapies. Now, as following on from these really powerful aspects, we did have two participants who focused on positive accounts. These were given as an aside, essentially, because they were much shorter and much less in depth than the negative aspects. That was just how they'd reflected upon their experiences of ABA. So there was nowhere near enough data to build a strong thematic analysis like hidden harms. So that is just to account here for the reasoning as to why these aren't thrown as an aside. These are just looking with a very small amount of positive reflection that was given. So both of these participants reflected alongside the broader conclusions reached by ABA advocates and research. So ABA taught me some amazing social skills and coping methods. They follow the promoted idea that ABA changes behaviour to those which are perceived as positive. And ABA stopped harmful, disfiguring behaviours when nothing else could. It stopped a harmful behaviour that would have had long life negative effects if allowed to continue. So as I begin to look here at the findings and start to understand the implications of our research, not just at the time, but now, they continue to have quite a powerful sentiment. And there is, I'll discuss after this slide, the kind of building research and understanding that has followed, not specifically from our research, but just the example that's being led by autistic voices being brought into these empirical findings. So the reflections empower voices which have spoken outside of academia. For so long, autistic experiences of ABA were shunned to the side, as I mentioned. As I mentioned earlier, these were seen as people who hadn't been through ABA, people who wouldn't be advocating, reflecting, empowering, and looking at ABA without having been through the intervention itself. One of the core messages reflects on trauma and disempowerment. This removal of autistic voice, removal of autistic self, removal of agency from the process as a whole. Is trauma worth these intensive interventions? Are there other ways that we can look and engage with autistic voices to create ways of learning, ways of aiding, ways of teaching that don't involve creating traumatic experiences, using physical intervention, using things such as shock therapy, removing loves removing stims, removing items that help us just regulate, stay content, and actually engage with a process, possibly a different process, which would see us as human. And this disempowerment surely can't be worth all this level of trauma. And to leave someone feeling disempowered following some form of intervention hasn't and can't have given them an empowerment, can't have given them a positive experience. There is a clear problem of double empathy within our participants' reflections and what was actually being implemented. So looking at this, these ideas of being left voiceless and mute, learned helplessness, removal of agency, there's no understanding from the opposite side, the non-autistic side of the intervention, understanding the needs, the processes, the actual outcomes that things such as stimming have, the contentness, the regulation, and just the way that we can calm ourselves through certain items, certain processes. So there's no understanding, or a lack of understanding, from the intervention and behavioural intervention itself, as Sarah talked about in operant conditioning in the presentation before. There is no clear understanding of the reasoning behind certain stims, certain regulation, certain items that we carry. So the acceptance of the autistic processes need to be interrogated before seeing a need for removal or change. So that reflects again on why are certain things being removed. Look, take time, reflect, engage, and understand why certain items are used, why certain processes such as stimming are being followed by the individual. Look for the positive outcomes and the positive feelings that individuals getting before seeing it as something that might be unnecessary from your own perspective. We do have a small sample. It's reflective at least of a percentage of the autistic community and what's been happening within advocacy networks for such a long period of time. That's not to say that every autistic experience of ABA is going to be entirely reflective of our sample. That's not to say that this is the broadest sense of participant base. Davison has also noted that autistic individuals who oppose ABA are perceived as a minority, which, even taken into account between 10 versus 2, with our research and looking at, I'm going to talk about later, Anderson's research, these individuals are not necessarily a majority. They're just perceived as a minority, because there's such a small area where advocacy can be given and spoken about without being put down. It's essentially people who've undergone, or a group of advocates versus huge network of ABA practitioners, ABA networks, ABA providers, and the implications for ABA practice, research and involvement of autistic participants are there in our conclusions and within the outcomes. That is something that so many people within our research felt is necessary for ABA practice to begin involving autistic advocates and adults within the process. So engaging and understanding from autistic perspectives. So this recent paper that I mentioned, Anderson, they've highlighted quite similar outcomes and perspectives from ABA as our participants. From their negative participant perspectives, they've looked at influencing the experiences negatively, looking to factors of trauma, how masking filtered into how they got through and managed to progress through the intervention by hiding their autistic self, the long-term mental health impacts, the unethical aspects of ABA from the participant perspectives, similar to ours. This isn't something our children should be going through. We reject your ableist philosophy and are focused on autistic voices needing to be connected with future research and outcomes. Anderson's work did have more positive interpretations of participant experiences, as they had more participants who had positive experiences. There remains a connection between Anderson's research and our own, which focuses on this removal of power and agency within the process. And this follows the growing conduction of such research, So there remains gaps to fill in areas for research to engage autistic voices and experiences within this empirical evidence. So as we begin to look on this removal of power and agency, as we begin to look at these positive interpretations, how do the negative aspects influence? If we're having less positive outcomes reported by autistic individuals, where do these negative factors, these negative experiences, how can we use them, bring them into practice, bring them into theory, bring them into influence? So since our research, there is we've had in this diagram on the right will show, research has begun to take note of the need for autistic voices to be better engaged within interventions, within ABA and within therapeutic processes. So the autistic experiences of ABA have become more noted in empirical research. ABA research has begun to take into account the implications autistic voices have when practicing theory. Excuse me. Questions on the impact of ABA have then become more prevalent in different fields of research. So we're looking beyond simply applied behavioural analysis, behavioural intervention, looking to speech and language, looking to occupational therapy. And then we have this, it follows into this growing body of research being conducted, exploring autistic voices within ABA and other early interventions. And then this becomes sort of a looping square. So as more experiences of ABA, as more voices become more prevalent, this continues and it loops round and it's growing and it's giving that empowerment and it's creating more knowledge as it goes round. So we've seen more trauma-informed progression towards ABA practice. Our research itself has seen citations in with more international implications. So the Indian Journal of Clinical Psychology, the Korean Journal of Clinical Psychology. So that's very small cohort compared to how you might see other intervention research looking, has had this, as having this influence, more profound influence internationally. So beyond bad behaviours, a call for occupational scientists to rethink autism. So how then bad behaviours are perceived, where this idea of normal comes from and where autistic voice lies. We're becoming part of a moralistic shift towards where neurodiversity fits within ABA and other interventive practice. Parents, educators and ABA practitioners themselves have actually begun to question the acceptability of ABA, the acceptability of its approaches to social skills, intervention as an intervention, the use of punishers, removing items, stims, and the perception of what social validity actually is. So this idea of what is normal and why are we forcing our children towards these ideas of normal, whose idea of normal, what is normal. And research is changing, with researchers beginning to interrogate conflicts of interest within ABA research as well. So that's a really strong starting point, as part of the argument given against ABA is that you either have had ABA, you're able to discuss your experiences. That goes back again to what I've repeated throughout. You either haven't had ABA and you've been given this extremist perspective by one or two small people. But as we begin to look at these conflicts of interest not being expressed within ABA research, we start to twist that and turn that narrative, and it's more of an evening of the fields. So concluding thoughts, the overall message emanating from our and others' research relates to a removal of power and agency within the intervention process. This is something that needs to be addressed. Therapy can't be either effective, ethical, and it should be empowering. So to remove actual power, agency and voice within any form of intervention is a massive disservice to participants, and it is dangerous and can create very vulnerable individuals who face a later on engagement and having to work through their own trauma. Lived experiences are vital to untangling the perception of bias and understanding why autistic perceptions of ABA are as positioned as they are. Our research has faced within places we've been cited and where we've been interrogated, this idea of bias and our participants being biased. That's not, from my perspective at least, that's not something that should be taken as bias. We should be
Owen, sorry, we're going slightly past your scheduled slot.
Oh, sorry.
Could you wrap up in about 1 minute?
Yeah, this is just the last slide. So we should look at this idea of position. understand where our participants are positioned, how they're positioning as having been through ABA gives them platform in place to discuss these rather than seeing it as bias. We have this growing awareness and acceptance that autistic perspectives can change outsider perspectives in the actual practice. And this growing body of research has such broader conceptualizations and implications for ABA practice and the inclusion of autistic voice. And thank you.